What's going on, guys? Mr. Collins here, bringing you another episode of my podcast, Let's Talk History. So in this episode, I'm joined with my two co-hosts. Introduce yourselves.
Howdy, I'm Nick.
And I'm Stephen Lovelace. I teach computer science here.
And today, we're really just going to have just a conversation over some inventions, innovations in history. Some of them that changed the world and others that really were just goofy. So let's go ahead and hop into it. So the first one I really wanted to bring up was the printing press. So I believe the year was 1436. Johann Gutenberg creates the very first printing press that was able to mass produce pages of books or articles, pamphlets, whatever. And this really leads to information being able to travel a lot faster. Because you got to remember the time. You got to remember that this is the 15th century. And up to this point, if you wanted a book, it had to be handwritten. So think of the Bible. The Bible is how many pages? I mean, up to almost 1,000.
Yeah,
and if you wanted to have a Bible, you couldn't. I mean, very little people actually had access to their own Bible before the printing press. So what people did is in these medieval churches or these, old churches, there would be a Bible chained to the church, kind of on a booth outside. And there would always be a long line to this Bible where people could sit there, and it was all handwritten on animal skin or some form of ancient paper. And they would sit there and just read the Bible and in this big long line. And there have been cases where the Bible was actually stolen. And there was people trying to get the investigations, trying to get this Bible back that was chained up. So that one is actually a super important one that's happened within history. We live in the information age now. Information travels super fast, and we can thank that to the printing press. So you guys want to add to that any?
Oh yeah, I read somewhere that they tried creating a inkless printing press.
And how did that go?
It got discontinued.
I wonder why.
Yeah, I know, like you were talking about medieval times, like the penalty for stealing books out of either a church or a monastery or anything like that was literally death. They would
it was brutal.
Yeah, they would kill you if you stole your books, because some poor monk had to sit there and write for days on end.
If they can't, no one can.
And
Exactly. Yeah, I couldn't imagine, spending so much time on a book and it just getting stolen by some random fugitive and there being a whole search to try to find it. So again, that's a very important one to talk about. So moving on past that, I believe Mr. Lovelace here wanted to speak a little bit on the cotton gin.
Yeah, so the cotton gin, Eli Whitney is notably famous for the innovation of the cotton gin.
I can remember learning about it in school, Eli Whitney and the cotton gin.
Now, I would say that he's famous for that, but he actually didn't invent it. He re-innovated it. It came from an Indian roller. They used it as a cotton gin, but it was made for long, stable cotton. Okay. So he took that invention and reconfigured it to do short, stable cotton in the southern states, because it was made for long, stable cotton. And so what happened was he just had to rebuild it, because in places like Georgia, where it's cotton is just short, stable, it wouldn't work. Didn't work. But I would say what he's not famous for is mass producing parts for interchangeable parts for muskets. But that's where he made his money. He invented the interchangeable parts for muskets in 1798. He figured out how to manufacture muskets by machine so that the parts were interchangeable. Yeah. Before, you'd have to make a musket by hand. You'd have to hand mill the metal, hand carve the wood, everything. So he did mass produce those.
And even just speaking on the insurmountable impact the cotton gin had, what it did to slavery, especially here in the States. It really just made slaves even more high value, because they had to have people producing that cotton. And before, it was hand-picked. You had to actually get the cotton out of the plant, and you had to pick the seeds out one by one, and that was very time-consuming. And after the cotton gin was re-innovated by Eli Whitney and brought to the States, it really just made slavery such a larger issue than what it already was.
Yeah, and then talking about guns, I know Nick was telling me about a failed innovation with weapons that I found really interesting. Do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, it's the name of it is Hitler's Sun Gun, and the main component of it is they put Hitler ordered a bunch of people, I don't know how, put a big magnifying glass in space, and it would stay up there due to Earth's gravitational pull or whatnot, and then they would somehow tilt it and use it as like some gamma ray, something. I don't know what their plan was. And it would deatomize whatever, and it would just sit up there in space, and it obviously wasn't not created.
I mean, how do they even plan to control that?
I have no clue.
I wanted to know how they're going to get it up there.
Hitler had a bunch of crazy weapons like the Gustav
Bunch of balloons, maybe.
Yeah, and that's another big one, the Gustav Gun that Hitler created. It was a huge, I can't even remember the dimensions of it. And we could do a whole episode over Hitler's just crazy inventions.
It was about 13,000 tons.
Okay, so about 13,000 tons of gun that was transported on a railroad. And the shells, I know earlier you told me the size of the shell.
Their shells are like...
Was it like 46 kilometers?
Yes. It's,
don't check us on that number because it may not be right,
like,
but it was some
It's 2
stupid.
times bigger than me, and I'm 5'6".
Yeah, so some stupid large artillery shell that went in this thing.
And it weighed like, I think remembering it about 45 tons.
Yeah, so...
And it took 45 minutes to reload it.
The Nazi brain is one that is quite interesting to come up with something like that. So the Sun Gun especially, I mean, that's one you can't help but to laugh at, because how in the world in the 30s and the 40s, 1930s, 1940s, do they actually plan to get that magnifying glass up there?
This was before the space race.
Yeah, this is before, I mean, rockets were even launched into space to a large extent. But Hitler has a plan to get a magnifying glass up there and just deatomize whatever he wants to.
He always had a plan.
He always did.
It wasn't a smart one, but, you know.
At least it was a plan.
We were talking about, I think it was a German invention, the Krumlov.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about that.
The Krumlov. So, another amazing German invention, and I say that with air quotes, because this was a gun that ostensibly could fire around a corner. So, war is dangerous. You know, the amount of deaths by guns, I mean, it's insurmountable. But the way that Nazis, or these German soldiers, felt as if they could curb that was by creating a weapon that had a barrel that was tilted to a certain angle. Some of them were 45 degrees, some of them I believe might have been 30 degrees. But essentially you could just put the barrel around the corner to keep the soldier safe and fire around that corner. Seems like a good idea on paper until you actually do it. So whenever they decided to actually put this to the test, it would maybe survive a few magazines before the barrel just exploded in on itself. And even when it did work, the bullets just broke up into 1,000,000 pieces and the accuracy was almost zero to what you're trying to shoot at. So the Krumlov, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but the gun that fired around corners, almost a what if in history. What if the Krumlov worked? So yeah. Moving on with weapons though, another one that we did a little research on was the Japanese fire balloons. And these were called the Fugos. I hope I'm pronouncing that right as well. But moving past, you know, the German innovations, we're going on to Japanese now. And during World War II, the Japanese came up with an idea, and to give them some credit, this was the actual, from what I've read, first intercontinental weapons. So we know about ICBMs, I believe is what they're called, the missiles that now can shoot basically wherever you want them to in the world. Well, the precursor to this were these fire balloons, these Fugos. And the Japanese would inflate these huge, I believe, hydrogen-filled balloons. And they would load them with some kind of weapon, whether it was, you know, some kind of artillery or fire, some way to hurt somebody. And they would float them over the Pacific Ocean in an attempt that maybe some of them would get to the States and do some damage.
Like a deadly hot air balloon.
Almost like a deadly hot air balloon, you could say.
I was wondering. I was just thinking to myself, how are they gonna like fire the weapon once it got there?
There may have been some way that it happened. I have no idea what their idea was.
It hit something and then maybe.
Yeah.
Just blow up.
But what they failed to realize is that, you know, this was aimed towards Canada and the United States. So what they failed to realize in that is Canada is very big. And about 50% of Canada's population lives right next to Michigan. So the rest of Canada, this huge continent, is really just barren. And that's where a lot of these balloons went and ended up. So out of the roughly 9,000 that they launched, only about 300 were sighted in America. And those did not, from what I could find through research, did any damage.
It hit some moose somewhere.
It probably hit a moose somewhere up in Canada.
Maybe.
Some old veteran's farm.
Yeah, it might have, but certainly did not do the damage that the Japanese had hoped.
Oh, yeah.
So,
now, I know we're talking about balloons and flight. At first, you know, big innovation that we're still using today is flight. It started off with balloons, and they couldn't control which way the balloon went. There was no way really to navigate it other than just studying the winds and which way is the wind going to carry you.
yeah.
And then they started using gliders, but you weren't really overpowering thrust. You know, you didn't have any thrust to overpower.
It takes a lot of thrust to get something off the ground.
Yeah. And it wasn't until the Wright Brothers actually, you know, the Wright Brothers, Orville and Wilbur, they put principles of controlling the craft during the flight on December 17th, 1903.
So we're coming up on the anniversary of that.
Yep, we're coming up. It's going to be here in a few days. They had a successful flight of a heavier-than-air flying machine in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. I've been to Kitty Hawk. It's pretty. It's actually, I can see why they chose Kitty Hawk.
Oh yeah.
It's windy.
Oh yeah. Well, it's right on the coast.
It's on the coast,
so
and
you
it
get
stays
all the
windy.
ocean breeze, and it really works out.
And then, you know, just think about. I know we were talking about. I wonder if the Wright brothers knew once they innovated flight, but before they innovated it, everybody thought this is stupid. You're going to die. Everybody's dying, and the reason is the gliders. There was a guy. His name was Otto. I think he was a German, Otto Lenthal. He built 16 different gliders between 1891 and 1896. He made about 2,000 flights in the low hills out Berlin. Now, he died in one of his gliders because it crashed. But what he would do is just take off from the hill, glide, and see how long it would glide. And so it put a big damper on aviation. But they learned that you had to take a scientific approach to overcome the principles of flight. And they could prove they could do it. And they did.
They did.
And
I think I recall like a newspaper article from just a few days before they actually did their first flight, saying that it was impossible to create a flying machine. And it couldn't be possible for some absurd amount of years, like hundreds of years from now. And just days later, they pulled it off and they actually made it work.
Yeah, and you got to think, I mean, humans were thinking about flight since the days of what, Icarus?
Oh, yeah.
You know, and humans have thought about flight ever since Icarus. And then the Wright brothers pulled it off, and now, I mean, we've, you know, space travel, everything else. It's crazy where we've came from then.
I mean, we're just coming full circle.
Yeah.
I mean, Icarus flies into the sun. Hitler uses the sun with a big magnifying glass and melts continents.
And we were talking about the Wright brothers airplane, and then one of the Wright brothers, it was, I believe it was Orville.
It was Orville.
It was Orville that actually lived to see an airplane drop a nuclear bomb.
And that was on Hiroshima and
Hiroshima.
Nagasaki.
And that was a year before he died.
Yeah.
It was 19...
I believe it was 1948.
45.
It was 45 when the bombs were dropped, and he died in 1948. So imagine just seeing your invention that you spent so much time on and for good turned into that. I mean, I couldn't imagine how I felt after seeing this, but it happened, and he did live to witness this.
Yeah. And then A funny innovation that came out of that was, after World War I, between World War I and World War II, the big powers were looking into building flying tanks. Taking a big tank.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong with a big heavy tank flying through the air? And we already had airplanes, Now, that did lead to the flying tanks failed. It failed miserably. It was too heavy. It didn't have enough speed to take off. The amount of thrust you would have to overcome the drag just to get it off the ground. But it did lead to, now this was before big aircraft dropping tanks. They did look into dropping tanks with parachutes, with thrusters, to direct where the tank wants to go. I think I've seen a movie before, when they were dropping a tank and they were using the shells in the tank to direct which way it was going to land.
I mean, how else are they going to do it?
Crazy things like that.
And for those that don't know, don't think, when you look at these World War I, World War II movies, tanks are always just, going down the battlefield, blowing everything up. Realistically, tanks broke down 24/7. You had to have an engineer, a mechanic on hand all the time because there's always some hydraulic line going loose or an oil leak or something going on with the firing mechanism. There's always something wrong with the tanks. And again, more of that German innovation. They somehow believed it was a good idea to put wings on them and make them fly.
Yeah, and then getting the tanks to the battlefield.
There was that as well.
That was a big obstacle to overcome. Because you had to truck them out there, or you would have to put them on a train and unload them, and that's usually when somebody would attack and ambush them to destroy their tanks, because the tanks didn't have a long range.
No, not at all.
Not a long fuel range, no.
And when you look at tanks too, in the North African campaign of World War II, there were so many tanks of Hitler's army just deserted in the sand because they ran out of fuel. They got to a certain part in the Sahara Desert and there was no more fuel and there was no gas stations in the Sahara Desert. So the soldiers would literally just have to get out of the tank and start walking to the nearest place, to the nearest town, to at least find refuge. Crazy.
Okay, speaking of flight, didn't you say something about like some Call of Duty platform, like floating platform?
Oh yeah, so also, I don't know if this was German. This sounds German, based off of the Krumlauf and the one we were just talking about, the flying tanks. But there was a device, I believe it was World War II, that was almost like a flying platform that was hovering through, I guess, some kind of blade that was spinning, some kind of thruster of some sort. And the soldier who was standing on top of this platform could fire their weapon from on top of that, kind of like getting the high ground. The only issue was when that soldier got killed, because they maneuvered the platform almost like a hoverboard today. Like you leaned, and whichever direction you leaned, that's where it went. Well, what would happen when a soldier would get wounded or shot or killed and they slumped over? Well, that thing would just go due east in one direction and just take off and hit the nearest object. So all kinds of inventions that just did not turn out as they should have. So do you have any more you want to bring up?
Speaking on flight, I think this was French, but there was this dude, I don't know if it's before or after the Wright Brothers, I don't know a lot about it, but he made something where he would, it's like a wingsuit pretty much, and he would put it on his arms, and he got up on the Eiffel Tower and he was like being cocky, like insulting God, saying, I can fly and stuff like that, just insulting him, say a bunch of stuff. And pretty much, he jumped off to go and fly, and he hit the ground, and it didn't work.
It almost reminds me of that clip from the first Toy Story, when Buzz thought he could fly and he jumped off the stairs and he fell and broke his arm. So, I mean, just some crazy, crazy ideas. And don't get us wrong, I mean, out of everything we've talked about, I mean, the cotton gin and the printing press have actually been pretty useful. I mean, they were some of the best inventions that have ever been created. Yeah,
and the Israeli took, I don't know if they took the corner gun shot, the corner, shooting around corners, but they did create a gun attachment called the corner shot, using a camera and a screen.
Yeah.
and it'll flip around a corner. You know, it's been in some films and stuff like that. But they actually do produce that and sell that.
And that's what a lot of the Krumlaufs had, were periscopes, where you could see around the corner, or a lot of times they'd be tilted. Sometimes it was just an attachment to a gun, like you would just screw it on the end of the original barrel, and you would be able to peek it around the corner. It was mostly made for trench warfare, but it obviously didn't work out too well.
Not during that time. They didn't have cameras.
No, absolutely not. No. So anything else you guys want to add?
I think I have one more. There was a Nazi invention. So here we go.
Oh, better hold on.
It was pretty much, it would be dropped from an airplane, like to submarines. They targeted submarines, and it was a bouncing bomb, and it would hit the water and bounce until it hit its target, and then it would blow up.
What could go wrong?
I think I don't know what happened. I think it was expensive, or it somehow blew up the plane it was in.
Some, see that happening.
Some malfunction. I think it was time. That's probably why it blew up. It maybe blew up midair. I don't know what happened.
I mean, how could that go wrong? I mean,
we'll have to research that one for next time. Yeah.
So, I mean, so many inventions, and we could go on and on and on, just bringing up important inventions that changed the world. And we almost took that direction with this podcast, but thought it'd be a lot more fun to really just talk about the inventions that really didn't make the cut within reality. So I think we've dried up all our information. So I'm going to go ahead and just sign off here, guys. I appreciate my co-hosts coming on again. As always, we look forward to the next one. And as always, keep learning history, and we'll see you later.
See ya.